So now I would suggest that we immediately move to Michelle Egan's talk about external trade policies. If you have questions or comments that you are afraid to forget, please just type them in the chat box and we will not forget about them and get back to them after the presentations. So now, Michelle, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to start with a poem. I hope to end with one. I'll think of it as I go through. Thank you for EUCROSS. And the sort of human devastation and economic devastation of the coronavirus the pandemic has thrown into stark relief the challenges obviously facing Europe in the domain of trade. And I was tasked with 3 questions or 3 issues, which I hope to talk about. The first one is how the EU is responding to these challenges of polarization and trade and contestation. And so I'll start off by saying that if you look at the 2015 Trade for All trade strategy with its subtitle, Towards a More Responsible Trade and Investment Policy, and you compare that to the trade strategy that was released last week, there's still a focus on many of the non-trade issues, such as sustainability, gender equality, and labor rights. But the context has changed, and the new document talks about an open and strategic assertive trade policy in the context of a changing trade landscape. So what a difference less than a decade has made. And so at first glance, if we look over the past few years and thinking about this polarization and contestation in trade, there is disagreements over agricultural market access. There's detrimental effects of non-tariff barriers. There's the imposition of tariffs, most notably by the United States, on important sectors. And that's continued to dominate the headlines, but it actually misses the significant changes, including the need to upgrade the international economic structure at a profound time due to these shifts in the emergence of global supply chains, the digitalization of the economy, and the increase in trade distorting measures, which I would argue preceded the pandemic. And so in response, the way I would think about this, how the EU is responding, is I would say Europe is recalibrating its trade policy. And so having operated in a global trade system, which experienced a deep transformation with the creation of the WTO and the proliferation of free trade agreements in what we called an era of competitive liberalization, to use the words from the USTR, with the United States, that competitive liberalization context has really profoundly changed. So the proliferation of bilateral and trilateral agreements really mushroomed after the 1990s. And then we ended up in the 2000s with these mega regional agreements that became also part of the trade toolbox in the 2000s. What's interesting is that more recently, as pointed out earlier panel, these trade agreements have actually excluded both the Europe and the United States, as illustrated by CPTPP, RCEP, and the African Free Trade Agreement, for example. So European trade policy is traditionally centered on the notion to what extent they open foreign markets, do they achieve comprehensive tariff liberalization, do they tackle non-tariff barriers, do they provide governance in new areas of the global economy? And we can see all of that in these agreements that were negotiated or ratified, like CETA, TTIP, the Japan and Mexico agreement. And so, but we tend to forget that much of what it did was in the area of goods, not services. And secondly, not only that, but interestingly enough, it did add new areas such as e-commerce and financial services or corruption. But also, one of the recalibration of trade policy is opening up trade barriers at the subnational level as well in these domestic markets, notably Canada and Mexico. But there's a deepening grassroots opposition to global trade across a range of issues, climate change, labor standards, dispute resolution, which I think has also generated stronger issue linkages in Europe through a greater emphasis on trade enforcement. And so Europe is now operating in this more adverse context of slow economic growth, pandemic, multilateral gridlock, the contestation to the international order, which I think has generated a change in tone and a shift in its new trade strategy to, in some ways, a more defensive strategy. If the 1990s was an offensive strategy, the 2021 is a more defensive strategy. And so liberalization has become this polarizing issue, both because we expect trade to do more, to offer growth without debt, and to provide the impetus for structural reform to kickstart slow-growing economies, and because we also blame it for many of our tribulations, the rise of income inequality, unfair trade competition, leading to the politics of grievance. And so trade policy has become incredibly complex, obviously a more intrusive regulatory trade agenda that reaches into domestic policy realms at the national and subnational level. And I think that sometimes when we look at EU trade policy, we don't think about what are the differentiated effects at the subnational and regional level. And obviously, we have these profound changes in international production and trade flows with the rise of global value chains and the increasing questioning of the distributional consequences of globalization. So when I say Europe has recalibrated its trade strategies, it's delivered varying responses and proposals at the global, regional, and bilateral level. And I'm going to give 3 examples just to suffice. So at the global level, the gridlock within the appellate body has generated an alternative proposal for dispute settlement that the EU has incorporated into its trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, the ICS. Europe has also worked with Japan and the US on anti-subsidy measures that ended up stopping last year and continues to focus on distortions of competition due to state intervention. At the core of this strategy, this new trade strategy, is reform of the WTO. So in terms of recalibration, the policy response at the global level is this reform of the WTO. In terms of the recalibration at the regional level, Europe has engaged in a lot of cross-regional trade agreements, maybe notably Mercosur, and has obviously worked to enhance its strategic partnerships with other regional groups. But it's also strengthened its foreign direct investment screening, though in no way matching the national security provisions and mantra of the United States under its CFIUS investment screening. It's also promoted its rules and standards, exporting its internal market in new areas such as data privacy. So that's the sort of recalibration that it is doing in the policy response at the regional level. And at the bilateral level, it has really focused on the effect of distortions on its internal market. And the example I would use here is the EU-UK deliberations on a level playing field. So here are 3 different responses at 3 different levels, how it's recalibrating its policies. And so the second thing that I would say is that I was asked, what are the strategic changes and continuities in the EU in a time of crisis? And so I was thinking, what's new, what's different? That's what I was asked. And so I was thinking, there is the new concept of open strategic autonomy that has generated a lot of discussion amongst trade analysts, trade scholars, and for some critics, it's a phrase. It's a shallow concept that masks somewhat different and competing objectives. On the one hand, you want open. On the one hand, you want strategic, with fears on protectionism. On the other hand, autonomy. What does that mean in a global economy? So I do think there are broader strategic changes in trade. It's not all the same. And I would say the first way that I think that what's new, what's different is the risk management strategies to promote resilience. And I think the EU is moving in this notion of risk management in trade policy. And first of all, it's a lot of that risk management, a lot of the non-trade policy objectives are included no longer as kind of values and simply saying we would like these values. I think these non-trade policy objectives are included as part of unfair competition rather than simply express values. And here I'm thinking the labor and career issue and the enforcement process. I'm thinking of deforestation in Mercosur agreement, or I'm thinking of anti-corruption in the EU-Mexico agreement. They're no longer values, they're actually institutionalized in these agreements. The second thing I think as a risk management strategy and change is the diversification of supply chain discussion. I do not think that's about reshoring, though that is certainly the discussion that's taking place here in Washington. I think it's about avoiding dependence and also the concern about the concentration of suppliers. I don't think European business is thinking about reshoring. I think it's concerned about concentration. I think the third issue is trade enforcement. And this, I think, is new as a risk management strategy. And I think it's about the enforcement of rights and obligations as distinguished by the new trade enforcement officer and the activities in that area. And the fourth risk management strategy is China. That takes up greater obligations in international trade and dealing in parallel with the negative spillovers caused by its state economic capitalist system. China's got a much more prominent role in the EU's new trade strategy. It's so much more, visible in the trade strategy in terms of risk management than the really limited, more subdued reference to the transatlantic economic relationship. The difference is quite extraordinary. And the fifth sort of risk management strategy is upgrading of the international economic structure, architecture. That's very pressing due to the rise of economic protectionism. More than 60 countries put protectionism on medical equipment, PPE, and so forth, some of which has been removed, but some not. And then there's also the shifts in the modes of production from manufacturing to services to digital, and the need for new rules to deal with non-market economy commitments. So those are and then finally, strengthening social inclusion and democratic governance. All of these are risk management strategies that I think the EU is doing in a much more concerted way. That said, there's also continuities in how the EU promotes and operates in terms of global governance. And I think the continuity is continuing with free trade agreements. And what we tend to forget is how unusual the EU is in terms of global governance, because it has a diversity of different economic relationships and ties, whether it's customs agreements to development aid. We have so many more differentiated economic partnerships than simply free trade agreements, so sort of a spectrum, a heterogeneity, and that continues. And that's been there since the foundation of the EU in trade policy. The second continuity is being itself a construct of multilateralism. The EU has a vested interest in preserving multilateralism as it's the foundation of governing for the international economic order, international economic relations. And I think the third continuity is the absolute gains approach that the EU continues to do. Ultimately, it wants to incentivize cooperation or connectivity. And so when a conflict of perspective emerges, the remedy for the EU is bilateral negotiation. And I would argue, going back to the earlier panel, that sort of absolute gain, the remedy of bilateral cooperation, is what drove the 𝗘 and also the limited trade deal with Trump. And so if I go to the third part that I was asked to do, so how does the EU legitimize its policy objectives and its policy making in a time of crisis in the trade sphere? And I think Europe is really trying to promote international economic engagement while also managing the economic and geopolitical tensions between the US and China. And so the EU's contribution to polarization and contestation is incremental improvement in addressing trade gridlocks. I think the EU's model and approach is incrementalism, not fundamental transformation. And so populists across the spectrum are sort of, their fundamental complaint as populists to what is going on in the trade sphere is that a lot of new standards and processes, whether it's adjudication of trade disputes or standards or harmonization or rules, are created without deference to national democratic processes. So what do I mean by this in conclusion? Why did I frame it as this, contestation, cooperation? What is the EU doing to legitimize its policy objectives? I think there's a trade-off, and the EU is facing that trade-off, which is evident in its new document. How do you combine the contradictory goals of economic competitiveness, social legitimacy, and political viability? In terms of social legitimacy, you want more transparency in trade, but that leads to greater mobilization and more different viewpoints to coordinate and get collective action. And of course, you then have a more complex ratification process, especially if you include investment. The second point, so there are also trade-offs between efficiency and legitimacy. If you want open trade policies, you also have skepticism on the merits of trade liberalization. And so what you find now in terms of the contradictions is a contradiction that how do you deal with, you have the first problem of social legitimacy. The second problem that you have is in terms of economic competitiveness. You want market access, you want to set the agenda, you want to exercise leadership in global trade. But on the one hand, Europe's been hampered by the abdication of US leadership in global governance. And so the structure of consensus and the promotion of economic competitiveness also often requires trade adjustment assistance programs. But if you have trade adjustment assistance programs, you compensate the losers, you don't get domestic structural reform. Again, a trade-off. And so from that point of view, the third trade-off is political viability. If you negotiate an agreement, it requires political approval. And so political pragmatism may prevail. So that, you're reluctant in the EU to impose tariffs in the Airbus ruling on the United States. You also have political viability when you have to sort of the trade-offs about how do you reconcile these three objectives: the economic competitiveness that you're seeking and the trade adjustment assistance, the social legitimacy and the mobilization and contestation, and political viability when you're moving away, when you have consensus in the WTO, when you're having plurilateralism, and when you have an abdication of US leadership, and you have a complicated ratification process with very divergent national perspectives on trade in the EU. Thank you.
Thank you. That was using Assad 3 minutes. So on total, I think we're still fine. And I'd like to give the floor to Kolja now to actually probably deepen some of the thoughts on legitimacy in times of crisis. Kolja, you have the floor. And you're muted. Still muted?
Yes, I'm here. I will share my slides. Just a second, please. Then we can start. Right. Sorry, I'm having problems here. All right.
Così è muto, però si muove. Così non è muto. È così?
I'm very sorry. It takes longer than expected because I have to go through a whole list of documents here. I'm right with you. All right. Okay, so take this off my speaking time, Katja. So my contribution basically starts with a first, sorry, for one reason or another, it doesn't react here. I'm very sorry about this. All right, I have a problem here with my slides. I'm very sorry about this. I don't really know what's going on. All right, I will try without my slides. I'm very sorry. So I think in terms of the question of the EU's strategy, strategizing and legitimization in times of crisis, we have to understand that in a way, the current problem that the European Union is facing has to do with an overall problem of the contestation of global governance institutions. In a way, and I'm following here to a large extent the theory of Michael Zern, the authority that has been lended to global governance institutions, and to a large extent the EU itself is part of that, has meant that more politicization and more contestation come to the fore. So in a way, you may argue that in the end, the success of global governance institutions is now causing a problem. Politicization in itself is not a problem, it just makes things more salient. But when it comes to contestation, it may mean that these institutions increasingly become delegitimized. That a delegitimization process through contestation, through actually questioning these institutions is coming to the fore. And of course, we have been witnessing that to a large extent, exemplified through the Trump administration over the last couple of years. Institutions that were actually relatively successful have been put in question, and actually the support of these institutions has been taken away. In a way, we can see the same in the European Union itself. The European Union is also increasingly contested by Eurosceptics and through the politicization of European issues. The question is, where does this lead to? And according to the theory of Michael Zern, there are two ways. Either, so to speak, the institutions strike back and there is a deepening of integration into global governance institutions, also a deepening into the European Union, or there is a decline. But that can only come to the fore. That kind of reinforcement of institutions can only come to the fore when they regain legitimacy. So how does the European Union at this moment try to regain legitimacy? How does the European Union think about global governance institutions and their regaining of legitimacy? And I think what is interesting is that we perhaps, before we go into that question, that we briefly understand what legitimacy is. In a way, legitimacy, according to some scholars, like for example, Catherine Sicking, is a relational concept. It's basically something that you don't have. You can only be given legitimacy. Others have to give it to you. You have to win the support. You have to win your legitimacy. And that, I think, is very important to be understood in the attempt how the European Union tries to now think about global governance institutions, but also about itself in global governance and about its own external action. In the new document that has been just published a couple of days ago, the joint communication on strengthening the EU's contribution to rules-based multilateralism, there is something very interesting in there. Basically, the document talks about building back better. And what, of course, the document tries to show is that after the COVID-19 crisis, a legitimate way of doing policy is related to sustainability and to resilience. You need to have resilient institutions, you need to have resilient policies, but they also need to be sustainability. And there is a good deal then in the document that talks about the Green Deal of the European Union. Now, we can also think about it in a different way. Basically, the second image, if you like, of building back better. And that means we have to win support. The European Union can only win the support if it builds better in a certain way. And so do global governance institutions. I think it is very important to understand what is actually in that document. In that document, it basically says, and I'm quoting, "To remain legitimate, multilateral order must respond to the growing demands of citizens in terms of transparency, quality, inclusiveness, and delivery." Now, translated into my own words, it means we have to look into input, throughput, and output legitimacy. Basically making sure that institutions are there, that citizens can be governed by themselves. Governance with the people, with the citizens, needs to be established transparently, and it needs to be about good solutions. It needs to be governance for the citizens. Moreover, in the document, it says multilateralism has and will remain the cardinal principle of the EU as the most effective means to govern global relations in a mutually beneficial way. But we cannot be multilateralists alone, nor only for the sake of it. Multilateralism must be effective, fair, and deliver results that serve both the EU and global interests and values. Now, that is output legitimacy. In other words, if multilateralism doesn't deliver, we are not interested. And that is, of course, something which we really have to look at. What does that mean? And Michel has already said something about the continuities and the differences. I think it's very important that we understand that in a certain way, here we have a continuation from the EU global strategy in 2016. The principle pragmatism is no longer used much here in the text. But what we see here is a very strong focus on the EU's own interests. It's not that the values fall away. Human rights are still there. Democracy is still there in the document. And they are also portrayed as principles that the European Union wants to fight for. But what do we do with the citizens' interests that the EU is actually responding to and wants to respond to? What if the citizens' interests are actually much more about the economy, much more about the jobs, much more about a narrative that we have been seeing emerging elsewhere as well? how far is the EU able to actually bring together its interests, the economic interests, and also values and principles. Now, there is a continuation, I think, in view of what we had in the EU global strategy, which was also having, let's say, problems to really explain how principled pragmatism would eventually work. And then we have a very strong focus, and that is also not new, on bilateralism implicitly. If multilateralism doesn't work, we'll do something else. And that is bilateralism. Michel was already alluding to it. Bilateralism is important in the absence of multilateralism. Bilateralism is also important in order to build multilateralism, obviously. But we should not forget, to a certain extent, that through this joint communication, I think, something comes to the fore, and that is that here bilateralism and mixed forms of cooperation serve the EU's interest, and that they at times may actually work much better than multilateralism. Multilateralism, in other words, remains driven by the question how supportive it is and can be for the making of EU external policies. That's something that Mike Smith has already written in 2007. And I think it's very interesting here to see that as a continuity. Let me basically then try to say something about the EU's search for legitimacy. I think we can explain the EU's search for legitimacy as a run for legitimate European responses and actions in global governance as one of, on the one hand, accelerating interests, and as well as one of persisting European principles and values on the other hand. How do you bring the two together? That remains really the big question. And it remains a question also, I think, because understanding legitimate action will always be a question of understanding it from various perspectives that do not necessarily consistently fit each other, and that overall may undermine the EU's perception as a legitimate actor, both internally and externally. I don't want to spend too much time on one example that was obviously a mistake by the European Commission. But basically, in a response to the problem of delivering vaccines, to think about stopping exports or actually scrutinizing exports to the world that would be produced on European soil, not only showed that multilateral action was in question, there was not even bilateral action in question, it was actually a unilateral move. That's how far it went. And that's a big problem. That's a big problem, and that's how far it can go if you follow the citizens' interest. I think we have to really reflect upon the question, where is legitimacy coming from? How can the EU legitimize itself, and how far will it lead us? One last question here on this issue. We will, I think, increasingly have to think about, as I mentioned before, internal input, internal throughput, and internal output legitimacy. But we also have to take into account the other side. How much is actually what the European Union is suggesting legitimate in the eyes of others? How much external input legitimacy is there? How much external throughput and external output legitimacy is there? I think these are the questions that we are still about to discuss and that we still have to be addressing when questioning how the European Union wants to legitimize its new strategies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was perfect timing. Well, 1 minute left. Okay, so then sorry, I have to look for my document. Then let's directly move to Magdalena Gora, who maybe will focus on similar issues, but really on internal contestation of the EU's global strategic objectives. Magdalena, you have the floor.
Katja, thank you very much. Thank you very much, organizer, for having me and for allowing me to share my thoughts in this interesting panel already. Many of the comments will overlap with what Kolja mentioned, because the internal contestation of EU's global strategic objectives is very much linked with the legitimacy and legitimization of EU activities. So let me come back to this at the end. I want to start with some conceptual remarks on internal domestic contestation. Contestation is associated with specific acts of contention over norms, specific norms. Contestation is something actors do. And why do they contest? If we use contest's concept, they aim at undermining or displacing, I quote here, an accepted or emerging into a subjective meaning through the formulation of competing discursive interventions that challenge the meaning of the norms, right? So the instance of contestation can lead to change, and that is, in a way, bringing into the story politicization, which is basically the implication of change over time, and this is an outcome of actors' behavior. So let's start. My focus here is on contestation, even though we still need to keep a politicization in a picture, right? Because this may actually result or be a result of contestation. So let's first focus on why do we witness growing contestation domestically within EU, within the member states of the foreign policy issues. And this is something that Kolja already somehow touched upon. This is because many scholars, including Michael Zurn and others, are already noted and promote the idea that we are actually witnessing a new political cleavage that appears in our societies, in domestic politics, that actually deals with the issues of international, right? So Hans-Peter 𝗍𝗄 and his collaborators were referring to the cleavage between integrationists and demarcationists. De Wilde, Koopmans, Merkel, Sirbis, and Zurn in the recent book calls it a division between cosmopolitans or cosmopolitanism and communitarians or communitarianism. And this cleavage is possibly something that is kind of diving deep into our fabrics of domestic societies, and it impacts how the political actors are structuring political conflict. As Michael Zurn puts this, I quote, the important element is, I quote, the underlying social revolution that triggers this new cleavage is globalization. And one can expect that the winners of globalizations are pitted against the losers. And this is something that goes into our societies, and it sort of is ultimately causing the contestation, right? So the growing prominence of global phenomena in domestic politics is making those issues a part of a political game. That happens on several levels. I hope I'll have a time to address this. There are possible putative effects of these processes. First, the steady, even if possibly at least symbolically tamed at the moment, rise of populist formations in Europe and elsewhere, because they usually act as certain triggers or triggering actors. Possibility of further deterioration of consensus over liberal norms, plus something that I call a contagious effect of this contestation. So who are these usual suspects in contestation? Research in particularly on European foreign policy, its various aspects, shows us that with time we observe an increase in number of radical left, radical right-wing parties, groups that are critical of EU's actions in arenas, domestic, national parliaments, but also European parliaments. But this is something that we had before as well. What happens recently as well is that we can see that the mainstream actors that were usually the non-contesters, they somehow pick up the topics that are raised by the growingly visible actors at the fringes of a political spectrum that aim at contesting certain issues, but also, as I think, Kolja, you've mentioned, the EU as such, right? So their contestation is very often specific, and I'll come back to this because this can only be really fully grasped when we will deep dive into what really is contested as well, not only who is contested, but also what is contested in a way. So the phenomenon that I think we observe is that mainstream parties, they kind of engaged in contestation in variety of topics related to EU strategic objectives, be that the relations with neighbors, promotion of democracy, trade, as Michelle was also demonstrating in her contribution. And this process is something that I think is the most significant element of this contestation, is that this contagious character, the sort of kind of deconstruction, if you wish, of this established norms, specifically fundamental norms, lead to weakening of legitimacy of said norms, right? This can be illustrated with the case of domestic contestation of, for instance, liberal democracy within the EU. Not all of it, but at least some parts. Promoting democracy is EU's strategic preference. Kolja mentioned a document which actually lists democracy among those values, right, that we want to promote. It's named in there. And yet we can see that this strategic objective is weakened not only by the fact that some of the populist, especially right-wing actors, contest that norm domestically, they shift those debates to the European area, but that is also significantly weakened by the fact that we have also the EU internal struggles with stemming illiberal tendencies in its member states, its inability to act, and ultimately this complicates the picture, but it also shows us very clearly that this sort of produces the sort of question credibility in activities. Many contesters are actually protected by the EU party groups, for instance. It's truism to state, but some of the contesters of liberal democracy are actually EPP members in the European Parliament, right? Some of them are in the ECR. These are mainstream parties. These are not the radical. These are not the fringes of the political scene in European Parliament. So this also has an impact on the overall discussions, taking this particular norm to focus on. Finally, there is also an interesting game between the national and European in that sense. In some instances, and I think maybe we should actually even add the additional level, because Michelle mentioned about the regional, right? The sort of the kind of some of discussions and some of the contestation of the EU activities are going as low as the regional level within the member states, but it also is focused on the member states and on the European level, usually European Parliament. And then I think what is important is that Kolja mentioned that one of the important dimensions to really measure politicization is the polarization of opinions. And I think we should focus more and more attention how the contestation and ultimately possibly politicization of those issues travels between the levels within the EU polity, and maybe to some extent to note that the contestation of domestic or even regional level should be taken into account early enough before it actually gonna go to the European level, which at least to some extent, for a variety of reasons, can be somehow insulated from this domestic polarization. And one of the important things also here to note is that apparently political scenes can get polarized over those issues in a relatively fast way. So this can be really a fast process that sort of can impact the overall perspective for the EU. And this brings me to this second point. If we agree that there is an increased contestation of foreign policy on or the EU strategic objectives that may lead to politicizations, what are the consequences? And the consequences for two questions that the strategic document asks. First, what are the consequences on what the EU wants, right? And for this, I think what we should really pay attention is what is contested. If we use the prominent proposal by Ante Wiener to divide the norms into fundamental norms, organizing principles, and standardized procedures, right? So then when the contestation is really on the fundamental norms, as in case of democracy, we can clearly see significant problems for EU strategic objectives, because it undermines those norms, it undermines the credibility, and so on, as I said. But if the contestation is rather focused or channeled, also something that Kolja raised, that maybe there are ways through mechanisms of legitimization to channel those processes of contestation, this expression of criticism into the political process, this might be actually helpful for the EU to adapt to demanding dynamic changes in international arena. I want to bring here a recent contribution by Anna Maria Slaughter and Gordon Lafforgue for, I think, Foreign Affairs, in which they claim that the international liberal order shall not be limited to states, but, I quote, to expand it deeper into liberal societies. There, civic, educational, corporate, and scientific actors can work with one another and with governments in ways that enhance transparency, accountability, and problem-solving capacity, something that Kolja already you were quoting a document by the EU in which we have almost similar sort of list of processes that actually are expected to happen to engage citizens, right? So this is something that I think this contestation on how we implement a certain fundamental norms, how the multilateral institutions work, and so on, can be channels. And to be honest, I think, Michel, you said that the EU itself is a multilateral product, right? And it does have a lot of instruments within the polity to gather those opinions of citizens, right? From the Convention on Future of Europe, this idea of bringing the instruments of engaging citizens, the instruments of participatory or direct democracy as much as possible to complement the representative democracy instruments. This is maybe a lesson that might be learned for sort of bringing some of the heat of this criticism for producing a positive outcomes. And that leads me to my last final comment. I think I have like maybe 3 minutes or 2 minutes. Katia, correct me if I'm wrong. This leads me to how it can have an impact on how the EU can achieve what it wants to achieve, or its strategic objectives. This brings me to the point, again, in this text by Slaughter and Lafforgue, they quote recent comments by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who sort of brings the notion of networked, inclusive multilateralism that, again, I quote him, engages business, cities, universities, and movements, right? So this is an interesting, I think, point that on the positive side, we can building on the sort of managed channels of contestation to bring it, as again, Ante Wiener claimed that liberal order shall be renegotiated at the local level. We shall hear what the local level tells us. This can help EU to achieve its strategic objective. But there is also a threat, and unfortunately, I'll finish with that maybe more bleak perspective. The threat is that foreign policy issues very often serve, and many cases shows that within the EU, as triggers for Eurosceptic actors to mobilize citizens not against the foreign policy issues, but against the EU itself or the established order, without really consideration for what are the consequences in a short, medium term in foreign policy itself. Just a brilliant analysis of Hans Vollert of the campaign around the referendum in the Netherlands on the association agreement between the EU and Ukraine shows you very clearly this was never about that case, but it was all about mobilizing certain circles. And that is something that we also need to take into account. To the great extent, it also is shown in instances of the trade agreements, right? That they just serve as triggers, but the consequences is much broader for this. And I think I'll stop here, and I'm happy to contribute to the discussions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So that already leaves us to our last speaker before we hopefully can get engaged in an interesting discussion. So we move back to a practitioner. Alexander, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Katja. Good morning all from New York City. And I think Magdalena kind of made a transition to my presentation by quoting the UN Secretary General. I will refer to that concept of network multilateralism, obviously, because that seems to be a little bit the holy grail of a revived multilateralism. But first of all, thank you to the University of Leuven and to Kolja and his colleagues for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be with you. But more importantly, thank you for always keeping present the multilateral outlook and the reach out to multilateral organizations, not least the UN, in all your activities. I mean, jokingly, I could say that you systematically mainstream multilateralism in whatever you do much better than the EU and multilateral organizations even do it themselves. This being said, it's nice to see so many familiar faces, whether on the panel, but also in the audience, basically a true global village. It was said by previous panelists, but I'd like to put it back again. I mean, I think Michel said that the EU has a vested interest to preserve multilateralism. It's an evidence. I mean, the EU by its essence is committed to multilateralism, whether this is by history, by its achievements over decades, mainly also learning from its failures, and also because it's deeply rooted in its values. I mean, the EU is an extrovert political object looking at the wider world because of its size, because of its economic weight, because of its increasing normative power, it does matter. But I want to say maybe even more and more because of the political role it dares assuming, concept of trying to have that strategic autonomy of the EU, whether this is still only on paper or in reality. But when it is fully united and when it takes proactive initiatives, it can show that it's not only a payer, which it is, but it also is a player in the international arena. And at the level of the United Nations, this is increasingly over the last 10 years valued and recognized. My former boss, PGA of last year, of Anga 74, coming from Nigeria, used to, and who wasn't necessarily a Euro fan, although not being against it, used to say, you might not always agree with the EU, but when you need them, they are there. When they come to you, they are prepared and well prepared. And when they act, they are reliable and they follow through. So in terms of legitimacy of EU action within international organization, I believe that says a lot. As a result, I mean, it's about this external legitimacy Kolja, I think, was mentioning in his intervention. In UN Circle, the EU is visible and does make a difference. Now, that can still be questioned. Is that, I mean, only on paper, or is it just a promising starting point? What is clear is the UN at large has a positive image. The EU at large has a positive image. The EU within the UN has a positive image, which does not exclude contestation, but at least the basis is sound in order to have a positive action. The challenge, as was said before, is to deliver, and it's to deliver together in order to keep that legitimacy in action. It's all about the 3 puts as Kolja has put them before. I'll try to see a little bit how this goes. I mean, there is still room for improvement, obviously. First point is unity, and I'll try to pinpoint a few reasons or areas for that. So I'd look at the EU at the UN in terms of status and institutionalization of that status, because it does matter, which brings me to a wider look at the strategy, meaning unity and coherence in the delivery within an international framework. And last but not least, looking at the improvements, looking at EU actions and those partnerships, which brings us back to a more networked multilateralism. The EU at the UN, for a long time, it did not exist. The UN is the most intergovernmental organization you can think of. It's one country, one vote. That doesn't mean that they all have the same political weight. It's a little bit Orwell's farm, animal farm here, but still on paper, everybody is equal. However, there are 2 milestones which act as a clear acquis for the EU at the UN. The first one is an internal acquis of the EU itself. It's the Lisbon Treaty, which brought a major coherence of the EU in its foreign policy coordination abroad. So the external output and legitimacy. The central role of the High Representative Vice President of the European Commission, the links between the EAS and the member states, but also, I mean, the fact that the EAS is an umbrella organization also to link the different policy areas of the European Commission, whether this is the development side, humanitarian, the trade, but also going into more what used to be considered as domestic policies, climate, digital, and increasingly health, given the current pandemic context. So in terms of UN issues, the RELEX cluster is, of course, in the forefront, but it goes beyond. And it's not uncommon when you have a normal General Assembly in a non-pandemic context in September in New York, that you have between 10 and 15 commissioners that are there in relevant high-level meetings, panels, etc. So a very wide, all-encompassing. Or in Geneva, has a really true role in terms of ensuring that coordination, whether this is at head of mission level on a weekly basis, but also on a daily basis, or whether this is at expert level, which means preparing the EU position, coordinating the 27 on every single action or issue or resolution by burden sharing between the different countries, and always within the respect of the repartition of competences between the EU and the member states. The drawback of that is that sometimes there's too much focus on coordination, which doesn't let a lot of time for initiatives. But there again, it's something which is very present and which we are working on. The second milestone is an external one from the EU scene, but an internal one within the UN. It's the EU status at the UN, which dates back from a resolution of the General Assembly of May 2011, which grants the EU an enhanced observer status within the UN system. That means the EU is fully fledged within the UN, has the attributes of a member state with the exception of the vote, but given the fact that it represents a big region, it usually speaks and acts on behalf of a group of states, which means that it speaks longer and very often first. And given the fact that it always speaks, there is a systematicity of optics that the EU is always present in every single debate and is expected to be present and is expected to have a position by like-minded, but also by non-like-minded, meaning both gathering support and maybe having those who want confrontation within the system, expecting the EU to stand somewhere. This being said, what is the EU strategy in terms of unity, which brings to visibility and efficiency and delivery in that system? As I said, coordination is key. The communication on EU contributions to rule-based multilateralism that was quoted before has the merit to put on paper and nail down a certain number of things that were floating around for years that hadn't been put down on paper since the global strategy and that now luckily are out there. So of course, it's all a matter of how to implement this by now. Coordination takes place, of course, it's overcoming silos, which is a danger in every bureaucracy. This happens in New York, in Geneva, in Vienna, in Rome, in the EU circles, but it also happens between those centers, those multilateral centers, which should communicate more. What happens sometimes is that the link to capitals or to the political authority that gives the mandates tends to be a little bit loose. When there is unity in Brussels, in the Council, finally, on a solution, there is no reason to reopen this in New York or in Geneva. So this is also a mission for the EU to call some member states to their duties. If they committed in Brussels, they have to commit in New York and in Geneva. It doesn't always happen, and it's something that has to be recalled. Pacta sunt servanda, in a way. But also what was mentioned is the link which needs to be increased between multilateral and bilateral. When the EU uses its network of bilateral embassies in order to feed into multilateral and the other way around, which is the thing the communication really points out, it is much more efficient to deliver as one, to deliver as Team Europe. Plus, of course, if it uses other fora like the G7 or the G20 in that respect. That brings to consistency in setting priorities in each and every one of these frameworks, whether this is now the building back better and greener, which should include the SDGs, the link to Agenda 2030, which includes fair trade rules, which includes the Green Deal, which includes vaccine for all as one potential area of tangible results to be delivered in order to increase that legitimacy of multilateralism. And these efforts of the EU are mirrored by the efforts the UN is dealing itself with. I mean, the reform ambitions of the Secretary General, the fact that the organization has to deliver as one. I mean, there are very many similarities because both organizations share the same DNA and they do face similar challenges. They have to use the privileged partnership, the fact that the EU is a strong pillar, financial and political, within the UN. And we see this now in the implementation of the UN 75 declaration and the recommendations the Secretary General is meant to come up with, but also in terms of legitimizing the regulatory cooperation and global norms that the UN is producing. UN is a big norm producing machine, so is the EU. The issue is, how do you manage to trickle this down to we the peoples? How do you gain the citizens' trust? I mean, for that, you need to use member states, of course, but also all the different levels within the member states, like parliaments, like civil society, like businesses, like others. Again, the network multilateralism that will bring those norm productions and give them a tangible reality for the people. The actions that are being taken is, of course, regular institutional dialogues and summits between the EU and the UN. This is something we are really boosting and working on. The EU to speak with one voice in every single agency, and we see that this works. For instance, on COVID, with the EU pushing behind the scenes in the World Health Assembly, for instance, but also improving coordinations at the General Assembly, within the agency's strategic programming, at the UN Security Council between European members, and in how we fund the system or contribute to fund the system. That doesn't go without partnerships with states, of course, the like-minded, and now here the US again back on the scene. I mean, that's a big change because it was very difficult over the last 4 years. Let's don't hide this. With non-like-minded, where we usually tend to clash on values, and here I think the whole scheme on trade-off, which is the one that you also have in other areas, with China, for instance, the whole issue of rebalancing, is how can you link converging issues with difficult issues or overcome difficult issues by getting a trade-off with converging issues. But also new creative partnerships that don't go along the traditional division lines, like EU and G77 plus China are usually the two opposing blocs in the General Assembly. How do you circumvent this? Aren't there other types of alliances that can be built? And the communication refers to this as well. Can't you link to small states, for instance, to developing countries, to EU-Africa partnerships, etc.? So all these kind of EU strategic partnerships on the bilateral level need to be more and more incorporated into the multilateral strategy. And of course, that means expanding the networks beyond the states to academia, of course, because that's where ideas come from, but also civil society, where there is still a lot to do at UN level to engage with civil society. The UN is very timid when it comes to non-state actors. Youth seems to be an entry point and always pinpoint as the one. The danger is, of course, that it hides the forest. So, I mean, it should be taken for what it is, but also include parliaments, businesses, cities more and more. And the years ahead will tell whether the charter can be actually revived in that view, because back in 1945, there was a lot that is today on the political agenda, which is nowadays missing. So are we going towards a new San Francisco at some point? I probably don't believe this is going to that's going to be the case, but this is a little bit the thinking that should lead us if we want to keep the legitimacy of multilateral action. And as I said, it goes together with the delivery. We'll see. A second mandate of Gutierrez is probably ahead of us. I mean, at least he's seeking one. And if he gets it, they say the international stars are much more aligned than they were 4 or 5 years ago. So there isn't really an excuse not to do this. And the EU is in good position to co-shape that agenda. And it should start as soon as now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There was also perfect timing. Everyone, all the speakers stuck very well to the 15 minutes we gave them, which actually leaves us a whole hour for a discussion. So maybe some panelists have also some questions or comments on the other presentations, but I first would like to give the opportunity to those who had to remain silent until now. So everyone in the audience, you are more than welcome to ask questions or provide us with some of your comments. I already received one in the chat from 𝗍𝗫𝗃. A question to the organizers: can we ask the people to ask their questions themselves, or do I need to read it out? Can we give them the floor?
They can unmute themselves, yeah.
Okay, so 𝗍𝗫𝗃, if you want, unmute yourself and feel free to ask your question yourself.
Thank you, Katja. I have questions to Alexander. I wanted to ask, like, how the UN is dealing with the regime complexes. Like, there are a lot of organizations in EU systems and also within EU framework and every country which are funding these international institutions. And also we can see there is lack of effectiveness in dealing with global governance agendas, specifically with the economy, also with the recent COVID, and also there are rising global south multilateral institutions. So I request to reflect on these issues.
Thank you. Do you have an answer?
May I just say, I'm not sure I exactly got your question. Is it 𝗍𝗫𝗃 talking? Was that it? Because I couldn't see you, so
yeah.
It's just, yeah.
It was 𝗍𝗫𝗃, yeah.
Because sometimes your voice went on and off. Could you just repeat your question in a shorter way?
Yeah, how the UN is dealing with the challenges created by regime complexes in general, was my question.
Okay.
Could you hear it?
Not really well, I'm sorry.
Okay, so the question was about regime complexes.
Yeah.
So different regime or parts in treaties,
yeah.
On the same topic. How does the UN deal with those regime complexes?
But I mean, do you mean in general or on specific issues?
Not sure whether this seems probably to be a problem with the connection. So the question that I got was, that was typed in the chat, how does the UN deal with the regime complexes, the lack of effectiveness in dealing with global governance as a result of it, and rising global South multilateralism?
I think the UN is first and foremost a place where, I mean, just like the EU, where solidarity is playing a key role. Now, the problem is often, and I think this is one of the fundamentals of the UN, is not to leave anyone behind. So, of course, there is the constant opposition between the global North and the global South. Also, they have the feeling that this is not any longer necessarily the only paradigm of division. I think that the division lines are more complex than that. However, the fact that there are these discrepancies is something which is extremely present within the UN. But I would like to remind that, I mean, the UN is a group of member states where all are part of the decision making, and all are very clearly also influencing and taking part into shaping the solutions that are provided.
Thank you. I received a message in the chat from Laura Mirantian, I'm sure I mispronounced this, who has a question. Would you like to ask it? Because you didn't type it in the chat. Laura? If you can't take the floor, then maybe type your question in the chat and I can read it out for you. Or does it work? So maybe while we try to get Laura to ask her question, anyone else is more than welcome to also think about that question or comment. Ah, she has no microphone. So then please just type in the chat and I can read it out. But if someone else, maybe also the panelists, do you agree with everything that was said? Do you have questions or comments?
I have a question for Michelle,
yeah.
Perhaps to start with, and also to Assad. Perhaps I start with a question for Assad. Assad, you mentioned that the connectivity approach, the connectivity strategy of the European Union is now aiming to expand partnerships to basically reach out to specific countries. You mentioned India on the one hand, and that this ideally would lead to more, how can we say it, solidarity. Which we would then also find in, if I understand you correctly, find back in the way how certain actors are open for multilateral cooperation, to put it that way, together with the European Union, if I understand you correctly. At the same time, the connectivity strategy has always been seen as a counter geostrategic strategy of the European Union, which was very much pushed for as a response to the Silk Road Initiative of China. How do these two, let's say, reflections on the connectivity strategy come together? That would be my question for Assad. And for Michelle, the question, you spoke about trade-offs that the European Union is likely to face. Michelle, you mentioned that there may be a trade-off between economic competitiveness, social equality, and political viability in the future. Could you perhaps elaborate a little bit more to which degree you see such trade-offs already in some of the ongoing agreements and negotiations, perhaps also in view of the latest China investment deal? Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle, would you like to answer?
I'm sorry, I wasn't sure.
Oh, sorry, is that?
No, if you're giving the floor to me or to...
Yes, yes, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I meant to say.
So, Kolja, your question about what do these partnerships mean? I think what we want to do is to reinforce the value-based partnerships with like-minded. So I think for that, we're working closely with Japan, India, looking about engaging also with the United States and others. But I think there are also issue-based coalitions with maybe those that are less like-minded. And on that, we're looking also at global goods, climate change, diversity, and health. You mentioned China. With China, as you know, we have a multifaceted approach. So China is a partner where we cooperate. It's also an economic competitor. And thirdly, it's a systemic rival. And I know that there was a question about human rights also alluded to in the chat. And I think that's one issue that we do take up. So this is a multi-vector approach. Regarding what are the deliverables of the connectivity partnership with our partners? With Japan, we've identified cooperation on the 4 pillars I mentioned: digital, transport, energy, and human connectivity. In Africa, in the Western Balkans, in Eastern Partnership, in Central Asia, and in the Indo-Pacific region in 5 areas. And on that, we just had a call with the Japanese counterparts this morning, and we've identified quite a few areas where we're working together in Africa, wind farms in Kenya, in Egypt. We're supporting the corridor in Mozambique, Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Uganda, and so on, as well as working together where we can between Japan, the EU, and the US. For example, in ASEAN, next week we have support for critical digital infrastructure. So I think there is one geopolitical message, if you like, but there is also a commercial engagement where we can see the EU and our partners working together also. I wouldn't say build back better, but maybe build forward better. I'm being a bit provocative, but I think we need now try to be even better than we were in the past in looking at global standards, for example, on digital, on satellites, on e-commerce, e-governance, e-health, some of those sectors. Last point, if I may, the connectivity strategy is not a reaction to China's Belt and Road Initiative. It's actually to advance EU's own interests and values. And we work with China as well on the connectivity platform, but we work with others maybe more deeply that are more like-minded. And I think that's, if I was to maybe just give a last message, I think we uphold what works, we reform what needs to change, and we wish to extend global governance into new areas. So those would be the 3 takeaways if I can. Thank you.
Thank you. And one of the last points you made about the connectivity strategy being about advancing EU values links very well with Marina Meller's question that she posted in the chat. And the question goes, human rights have become one of the central elements of US foreign policy towards China. Will we be able to say the same for the European Union? Not sure who feels able to answer that question.
I can jump.
Yeah.
But maybe after the other panelists would like to intervene, then I can also give my perspective, having been in China and looking at human rights in particular.
Does anyone else want to respond to that question first? I would say, Assad, go for it.
So I think I've seen the EU in action in engaging with the different Chinese interlocutors, including in the summit when our leaders have raised these issues. I've also been to Xinjiang. I've seen the camps. So they organized a visit to what they were calling a vocational education center. But it's quite troubling what's going on there. They have people who are aged from 18 to 60, 65 who are in these centers. People who are from different social backgrounds, educated people, men, women, people who've left their children, their husbands, their parents. This is applying to people who are, it's basically camps for Muslims, because they have from the different ethnic minorities. I think there are 56 ethnic minorities, 10 of which are Muslim in China. What was also troubling is when I went to visit the we were going on an official tour, so we were always accompanied, but you also go to kindergartens, and the kindergartens have barbed wire around them. So this is, we wondered why on a Saturday they have barbed wire around these kindergartens, and what we were led to understand is because the parents are in camps, the parents are being re-educated, so the children are then being re-engineered, if you like, into being good Chinese citizens. So I think these are very serious concerns we saw and we have raised. Maybe even more troubling is when we visited people's homes. Katja, there are people living in your home. So you have a relative appointed by the party. The party will designate a Communist Party member to live in your home, and that person is going to watch what you tell your children, what you eat, if you pray, what books you read, what television programs you watch. That person is with you all the time. So we saw, I mean, parents and grandparents are terrified of their children and grandchildren. This is happening in the 21st century. So this was raised by the EU privately and also publicly. This has been raised also by the European Parliament in various resolutions that have been put forward. I've also been in touch with the colleagues from the United Nations, various agencies who are based in Beijing. And I think the diplomatic community is aware of what's going on. There are some concerns about the consistency of human rights being applied, but I would assure you that at the highest level, this is taken seriously by the EU leaders, and we hope to take this forward. And this is one of the reasons why China has been designated in such a way as a systemic rival. I'm also trying to find a link with connectivity. So it's maybe a question that why is it that many countries, including Muslim majority countries, have not raised these issues? And I think the fact is because there are investments being made by China under the Belt and Road Initiative, including in places like in Central Asia or the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. When the Prime Minister of Pakistan was asked about this, first he said he wasn't aware of what was going on. Then when he was asked on another occasion, he mentioned he was aware, but he didn't want to interfere in local politics. And another occasion when he was asked, he said, I mean, China is giving us aid, is giving us vaccines, So I think the world is a much more transactional place. And I would also turn to Alexandra to say, the three pillars of the United Nations are peace and security, prosperity, and human rights. So we must be upholding those principles, not just talking about them, but putting them into action. Privately speaking, and I know this is Chatham House, but an open webinar, I think we have to distinguish between what the party is doing and individuals within the system. So we should not be stigmatizing individual people from China, from what is actually a policy that is being rolled out by the Communist Party. So I'm glad that the question was raised. I'm not really providing much answers, but I would like to give personal testimony that we are aware of what's going on, and we need to go from words into actions. Thank you.
Thank you. Alexandra, you raised your hand. Is that in direct response to that topic? Okay, please.
Yeah, that was my idea, and thanks again for the explanations that were provided by Assad. I think the hypocrisy, of course, of or let's call it the discrepancy between the words and the action is patent, whether this is at national or sometimes at regional or at global level on this case. And I think on this specific example, we've seen it all. That doesn't mean that we are not consistent, I believe, as EU in holding firm onto the values that we defend. We do it more than others. It's probably not enough. And again, there are always some trade-offs. I think we've seen it in the field of trade, for instance. But from what I see in our action here at UN level, it's something we systematically come up with. Now, that doesn't mean that we always win the votes and that we always manage to get it into the texts, whether this is about human rights at large or whether this is about taking into account the voices of civil society, which is another big difficult issue, and they're often linked because civil society is usually a threat for those countries who have issues with human rights. That's where they're, and those countries also are part of the European Union increasingly. Let's don't forget this. I mean, this is something that pops up very regularly. But you said it, Assad. I think we're still doing the best of that. The UN hasn't been exemplary on how it tackled the Chinese case here. I mean, in that specific example, the civil society has been quite vocal in saying that the Secretary General didn't have a very clear position on the issue of the repression on Uyghur minorities. Well, I mean, there's no investment issue at stake, but let's just don't forget that China is one of the P5 and it's one of the deciding votes when it comes to appointments within the UN. So there's no real much mystery about this. Let's see how this unfolds in a few months' time.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Did anyone else want to chip in on that question? No. So thanks, Mariana, for raising that very important question. Next one on my list is my colleague, Jan Wouters. Jan, can you take the floor? Does that work?
So do you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'd like to engage with the panel with regard to this beautiful joint communication of the 17th of February with regard to the EU's contribution to rules-based multilateralism, and in particular, what the communication says and does not say with regard to the EU in multilateral organizations, because as Alexandra has, of course, rightly stressed again, speaking of the UN, it's a very intergovernmental organization. It's very Westphalian, and the EU is a strange animal and still needs to find its proper place there, especially in terms of institutional position, not just in like the main organs. We know that in the General Assembly, things improved since 2011, but what about the programs, the funds, many of the specialized agencies? And let me point to a couple of issues that I would like the panel members, including our colleague from the EAS to engage with. First of all, the communication says that we should strengthen further coordination between the EU member states and the EU delegation for like, say, taking positions and speaking with one voice throughout the United Nations. I've always been struck by the fact that indeed there is a very strong coordination and comprehensive coordination system for a place like the General Assembly, but that, for instance, when you talk about the programs and the funds, which touch very often on issues that we consider to be community competences, like development aid, like humanitarian aid, and so on, that very often coordination seems to be lacking there. So for me, it's a big paradox to see that in more CFSP-oriented areas, there is a very strong coordination process, whereas in the more integrated policy competence areas, the TFEU areas, as we could call them, there seems to be hardly any coordination, and EU member states seem to most of all pursue their individual kind of policy goals, including elections to seats and what have you in those programs and funds. So I'd like you to comment on that, because I really have always been puzzled by this remarkable thing. Secondly, on the institutional position, that remains a very, very big problem because of the Westphalian nature of most international organizations, not just the UN. When you have to be a state in order to be a fully fledged member, the EU always has a problem. I see that there is beautiful language in the new communication about, enhancing the status and, saying that the EU actually merits even membership status in quite a number of organizations. But I don't see concrete initiatives, and I definitely don't see an overall strategy. And that's really, for me, something very strange. Why is the EU not developing a more comprehensive strategy on enhancing its participation and status in multilateral organizations? There are lots of examples we could mention here, but let me just flag the IMF as one of the worst cases, where we talk about an EU exclusive competence, namely monetary policy, and where in fact the status of the EU is absolutely nowhere, in spite of the fact that since the Treaty of Lisbon, we do have a legal basis in Article 138 of the TFEU to make sure we can have a unified position within international financial institutions. For me, it's a mystery why indeed in this communication there is no talk with regard to the IMF specifically of enhancing the position of especially the Eurozone countries. Last but not least, if I may, Katja, leadership and mandates in multilateral organizations. There's also beautiful language, and I like that because the EU realizes that indeed the leadership of international organizations has become a very competitive thing, and that especially countries like China are nowadays very, very strongly pushing for obtaining as many director general positions in specialized agencies as they can. They have already 4. Last year they tried WIPO, it didn't work, but it didn't work because of a last moment mobilization against that candidacy. But the question is, in the past, we, the Europeans, have been notoriously good at competing between ourselves by pushing our own candidates in international organizations rather than pushing a commonly elected or commonly designated candidate. Same thing for the competition, the rat race for a country to be elected on a non-plenary organ like the Security Council. I remember 2016 when 3 EU member states were running for 2 Security Council seats, namely Italy, Sweden, and the Netherlands. And it ended up in a very strange way because the Netherlands and Italy basically chopped their 2-year mandate into 2 mandates of 1 year, which also was not a very satisfactory arrangement. Just to say, there are many things that we can already improve at ourselves with a better, let's say, coordination with our own member states. So I'd like our panel, if they want to engage a little bit with those issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Does any of the panelists want to start by reacting to?
I'm happy to come in,
Yeah.
if that's okay. Thank you, Jan. I mean, this is sharp as always and painful as always, because you put the finger right on where it hurts. And in this case, I think you put 3 fingers on 3 places where it hurts. On your first question about the fact that there's improvement in the GA, yes, there is. There is improvement on coordination, that there is an improvement on the coordination in terms of programming and funds. I think where it's problematic is that when it comes to the strategic programming in those programs and funds, that's where the EU central coordination is still lacking. And interestingly, the communication calls for it in a way, but you might be aware, Jan, of this non-paper by almost all EU member states, which is a first kind of non-paper reaction of the Council to the communication. That non-paper doesn't pick it up. It doesn't pick up on that programming. And that's key because that programming sessions within the agencies is where the priorities of the EU are streamlined into concrete work of those funds and agencies that the EU and the member states are financing. So obviously there's still a little bit of reluctance there, which is always the never-ending Westphalian reflex of EU member states coming back on that. There are pushes, sometimes successful, sometimes not, in order to have more of an EU presence within the boards of those agencies and programs, etc. But it is still very imperfect and difficult. So yes, you're totally right on this. But I want to say all these proposals that you're making, which includes the second one that you say, the overall strategy to enhance the status of the EU within international organizations, is something that should be brought forward. I mean, this communication is just the first step. It addresses Council and Parliament, who will react. So I really hope that if Council doesn't it, I count on the European Parliament to react in its resolution on the communication to come up with a certain number of those ideas, which will then make or don't make their way, but there are ways to put them into the pipeline. I wouldn't go as far as saying that being a member in all these organizations for the EU would make any sense. I think it's still better to have 27 when you can. Because you're also competing with the rest. But if those 27 are clearly aligned and are mainstreaming their priorities in a way that is coordinated, consistent, and coherent, that's the winning recipe. And that works also for nominations. You said it, we've seen that in the past. I have the feeling that now that we've lost one permanent Security Council member from the EU side and are remaining only with one, we might be a little bit more cautious in how we want to play our game in terms of candidates for the seats that we can gain. The positive thing for the EU is that we are part of 3 regional groups within the UN. I mean, Western Europe and other members, Eastern Europe, but we also have Cyprus in Asia, which is what it is, I mean, in terms of geopolitics, but at least it gives us an insight in different groups. And you know, I mean, that's the way it works at the UN is the balance between regional groups and the rotations within those regional groups. So I think the more we're scattered in that, the more we have something to gain out of this as well.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to react or share their thoughts on the various questions?
Maybe if I could, Katja?
Sure, yes.
So thank you to Professor Jan Wouters. Regarding the programming, I think the conscious effort people have realized here in Brussels that the way the multi-annual financial framework for the 7-year plan was done in the past, we need to do, due diligence, lessons learned, and do things differently now. So there's now a big push for the Team Europe initiatives and for getting member states also to put their money where their mouth is. So we have been engaged in multiple programming coordination with our member states here in Brussels, within the different formations, but also more importantly within the delegations. More power has been devolved to the heads of delegations, the ambassadors in various countries around the world. We have a deadline, which is actually this Sunday, for all delegations to provide their national multi-annual indicative programs of where the programming will go on a bilateral basis. And then the end of March for the regional programming. All of that is being scrutinized and coordinated both with member states in the field and member states in headquarters. I know the point was made previously that sometimes there's a disconnect between what the capitals have and what is happening in the field. But I think it's good that this has been taken into account, at least in terms of analysis. And now it's going to be a question of how we put this into practice. But I'm more confident, and having seen how the sausage is being made from the inside. I was in Central Asia and in other parts of the world where the programming was done. I think things are getting better. I agree that we need to have a much better coordination when it comes to international fora. I note that within the IMF that Jan was mentioning, the EU and member states hold 26% of the voting power of the executive board. So I think as the Spider-Man movie says, with great power comes great responsibility. So I think the EU, it's a good first step, but okay, the jury is out. Let's see, as Alexander mentioned, how things are going to roll out from here. But I think this is a good start. It's on the radar screen, and now it's up to people with a different pay scale also to grapple with this and take it forward. But yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you. Any one of the academics? We had quite some questions to the practitioners. Would anyone else, Magdalena, Michelle, Kolja, do you have anything to add to that question or those questions?
Yeah, I would just like to add that when you read the joint communication, it becomes interesting, I think, from my point of view, just to add to what Professor Wouters has said, that there seems to be also some strategic thinking of not only looking into basically how the member states can better coordinate themselves, but also to bring in another set of actors, which one could obviously look at as, in some cases at least, allies of the European Union. And these are civil society actors, these are transnational actors that can make the case for certain initiatives along the line of the European Union. I don't know whether that's the logic, but the idea is obviously in the strategy to talk about a more inclusive multilateral system, which we know has been a demand for a long time, to also bring that set of transnational actors much more transparently into the multilateral institutions, where sometimes they are already involved, obviously, but where much more can be done. And a second remark, which is interesting, is that where multilateral organizations do not work the way how they should, the European Union is also in this, or at least in this joint communication, it is mentioned that more scrutiny on scrutiny mechanisms should be paid attention to, for example, in the context of the Human Rights Council. So it's interesting. I find that we have, so to speak, that kind of additional line of thinking.
Can I add some thoughts, Katja? Is that okay? Sort of, my attention, thank you for the question, Professor Wouters. This is very interesting. My attention reading this document goes also to the places where we can see topics that pop out that require exactly what Kolja said, some kind of new thinking. And this goes into, and from my perspective, of someone who's interested in contestation, that I also carry a potential for future troubles. And one of those topics that is in the document, it's maybe not well developed, is the digitalization. The idea of sort of bringing to the table discussion and need for, as the document states, I think ambitious global standards and regulatory approaches in the digital economy. This, we are pretty sure, is gonna raise a lot of contestation, as well as we already had in the previous instances. Some of those issues surprised, legislators in the EU, like in case of ACTA previously, right? So this is also something that already is supposed to bring our attention, as Kolja said, to kind of prepare ourselves, the EU, but also the global community, for some kind of the safeguard solutions, if you wish, the kind of places where you can stream those debates about the potential controversies that will engage citizens in this kind of topics. Particularly digitalization, as we know, is also gonna be a topic along the Green Deal that is gonna structure a lot of significant discussions within the EU itself. Pinpointing and highlighting the existing differences of views on citizens level, on member states level. And it's not going to help for the EU to establish a common voice that can be delivered to the global arenas. And I think this is something that this document already is indicating. And I agree very much with I think Alexander saying that definitely European Parliament is going to be the place which will take that discussion for the as we already saw in the previous cases. Thanks.
Great, thank you. That was insightful and long or comprehensive answers. Michelle, you're the only one who has not answered or taken the floor yet. Is there anything you would like to add? Don't want to neglect you.
Just very briefly, I mean, if I was going to talk about what Jan had put on the table there, I wonder how much of this is a tension and trade-off between collective action versus bureaucratic inertia. So that would be the way I would very frame it. And what struck me is that I'll make one comment to Kolja, because he asked a question. And then if I was to take a step back from the panel and say, what did this reveal to me about contestation, polarization, and global governance? The first thing is that I would say this is an issue of what Kolja called input, but access and representation came up. So on the one hand, we have the issue of input, access, and representation. The second issue would be throughput, as Kolja said, which is about coordination and network multilateralism. The third issue was output, which is implementation. And the question is how does the EU navigate this in a contested and polarized world? And it seems to me like in shaping global governance, it has three things it's trying to do: strategic objectives, fundamental values, and norms. And just very briefly, I think Kolja had asked about trade and my triangle and my trilemma. And I think that, one of the things that was quite remarkable yesterday in the hearing for Catherine Tai for USTR was how she also used the phrase systemic rival vis-a-vis China. And it was almost like you could have cut out the name USTR and she sounded like the EU. And the comment I would raise about the triangle is if you apply it to, say, China, and you're talking about 𝗘, on the one hand, the EU would argue that they are getting economic competitiveness in terms of greater market access. The second argument, the social legitimacy angle, as was raised by others, it's the resolutions and parliamentary concerns about human rights and labor rights, not just towards China, but towards Korea and towards other sort of value-based issues. And then the third element of the triangle is political viability. And here I would say political pragmatism, because a lot of people in the jury will be still out, is how much reform will the EU enable, domestic structural reform, when it sort of has pushed this agreement And some people might say, well, it went for pragmatism, for political viability reasons, otherwise China would not have agreed. And so the question is, can you get all, will all three actually, will you give up one of those three elements of the triangle? Thank you.
Thank you. Good. So actually, I now received the question by Laura, who was trying to ask a question in the very beginning. So I'd like to read it out. It maybe partially was addressed already, but I'd like to mention it nonetheless. So the question is, would a regionalization of the Security Council help better representation and facilitate decision-making? And with regionalization, she means giving seats to the European Union, the African Union, ASEAN, etc. This was not directed to a specific person. I think maybe Alexandra, you might be a good one.
Yeah, I mean, questions on the reform of the Security Councils are always the most dangerous to answer, also because there isn't really an answer. Otherwise, they would have found it after all these decades they're trying to reform it, or maybe not really trying to reform it. That might be the other thing. Yeah, it sounds beautiful. What is clear is that the Security Council doesn't have the regional balance that it should have. I think there everybody agrees. Where people don't agree is that to achieve this, you have to give up on other things. And that's where nobody is ready to give up. But everybody believes that for the moment, it's not any longer representative of the world the way the world looks. Now, is the solution the one that is proposed, that international organizations, regional organizations are actually taking those regional seats, and that would make it easier also to keep the numbers lower in the Security Council? Yes, in an ideal world, but you see, as perfect on that road as the EU can look in terms of having gained the sovereignty from its member states, etc., when it comes to those very hard sovereignty issues, it's still very tricky. So if it's tricky for a place like the EU, I don't want even to imagine how tricky it can be for the African Union, that is far not as integrated politically as the EU is, and other regions are even less integrated in that respect. So I really don't see how this is going to happen. And currently, I think there are many smaller countries, and small is beautiful and small is good, who are extremely happy to be in the Security Council. If you had Latin America having been represented by countries, do you think Uruguay would be one of those countries? Whereas otherwise they might have a chance to be in the Security Council from time to time. So I think there's also a lot to gain from that. It's not to get back to power politics. I take for an example when St. Vincent and the Grenadines were for the first time chairing the Security Council as member of the Security Council. It turned out that this was a very refreshing perspective on the way they were putting things from time to time. So in another kind of system, this wouldn't happen. So I think it's good. And frankly, what would the EU be if we wouldn't have Luxembourg to solve our issues from time to time, or Belgium? So that's, I mean, just on the joking side. May I just use this to also get back to Michelle? I really much like this idea of, is it collective actions versus bureaucratic inertia? I think it gives too much credit to bureaucratic inertia. I think there isn't that much in there. It's clearly an underestimation of collective action or what collective actions could bring to. But I think the reason is that political reluctance is still very, very strong within our member states, and just doesn't allow, I mean, just provides this blindness of how much more effective collective action could be if they were to step back a little bit on this, unfortunately. But I also had a question to you, Michelle. When you said about your triangle between competitiveness, social legitimacy, and political viability, which is very clear for the EU, and you've alluded to the fact that in some ways the trade policy or the trade vision of the US, at least as it stands these days, and the EU can actually be replacing each other. Do you think that triangle also works for the US trade policy in the upcoming context? I mean, the way our nations have been approaching trade, I mean, I think Americans have a much more pragmatic approach to trade than Europeans have. But is this social legitimacy issue becoming a concern now in this new United States we're facing? Because it clearly wasn't in the years ago, but now, I mean, is this something that comes up? And is this something that in the future could also become a significant triangle for more autocratic regimes where, I mean, inevitably some of those civil society components will develop and might have their word to say in that? Whether they can is another issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle, you have the floor.
Gosh, when a panelist asks a really tough question of another panelist. I actually, you know, part of me was thinking about this in the context of Japan, the United States, and not just the EU. And one of the issues that we don't tend to think about is, I was thinking in terms of social legitimacy. I would argue that started in the United States before it started in Europe, in the sense that we saw it around TTIP, then spilling over to CETA and so forth. We could argue, go back to 1999 and say Seattle for that social legitimacy and mobilization. And so I think now there is, you know, the way we think about it in the European context, it might be irrelevant for the US. It used to be when we talked about this mobilization, it was always about different interest groups, usually producer groups, winners and losers. Now that contestation, as Alistair Young says, is about the politics of risk and regulation. And there's a contestation, you know, food safety, environmental standards, and so forth. So social legitimacy, I would say, still, in some respects, you're seeing some of that debate in the United States as well. In terms of the economic competitiveness, I would argue that the debate in the United States may be going further right now because they've always had that trade adjustment assistance program since the 50s and 60s. It's never been really articulated and used. And I think that's where the Biden administration is really going to be, you know, the economic competitiveness is one thing, but how do you deal with offset the losers of globalization? And I think there'll be much more attention to trade adjustment assistance, whether you call that, and I wouldn't call that industrial policy. I would call that, you know, much more trade adjustment assistance than industrial policy. And I wonder, in terms of political pragmatism, I would argue certainly in the United States. I think in part because we tend to forget that, you know, the legal scrubbing that goes on in the EU goes on in various different, you know, goes on within Congress, who represent specific districts, and also the political viability and sort of pragmatism is also because of federalism and also because of trade promotion authority. So I don't know whether my model fits perfectly, but I see all of this as trade-offs, you know, in the sense that they're often contradictory goals, if that makes sense. You know, I go back to Magdalena and I would disagree with the premise of one thing, and that's just maybe just a different viewpoint. But Magdalena was talking about the importance of civic openness and more people mobilizing in different ways. And, you know, and yet to me, the trade-off of that, if you want more kind of social legitimacy, more actors involved, more voice, then you have a more collective action problem. So those are what I was thinking of as trade-offs. And, you know, the more you give voice, the more you increase transparency in trade agreements, the harder it is to get, you know, it can also have a backlash effect. So I'm thinking of really the trade-offs that occur in negotiating. Often contradictory goals is a very strong term, but that's where I was getting at. You know, if you have economic competitiveness, does that translate into domestic structural reform? If you have political viability, how much political pragmatism to get an agreement? And if you have social legitimacy, if you open it up for transparency and voice, how hard is it then to get to the finish line of ratification? And I think that applies to the US too.
Great, thank you. I have one more person on my list, and that's 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗀 again, with a question on China and human rights. May I ask you to ask a bit shorter question now, so that I can give every panelist some time for final statements?
Well,
Jan, you have
thank
the floor.
I will be short, but I will at the same time be a little bit more broad than human rights. It's about China in the UN system. As we have already seen, China is on the offensive. China is trying to extend its influence. And there are two places where this has been recently very, very interesting. And why is it so interesting? Because China is trying now actively to basically influence the norm-making process, both with regard to technical standards and with regard to human rights. Let me explain. There is the ITU, the International Telecoms Union, which is little known among the technical specialized agencies, but ever more an important place. And China is currently pushing very strongly within the ITU in order to basically have the ITU accept Chinese standards with regard to facial recognition. And that's, of course, a very hard nut to crack for us Europeans. Think of our privacy and what have you. And so it was only with the last moment mobilization recently that we were able to really get our act together there. So, I mean, that's one thing. And the second thing, the Human Rights Council. In the Human Rights Council, China has become extremely active, and in the sense that it really is trying to change the human rights discourse today. So also a bit of the normative question. And I remember in the last Human Rights Council session in the autumn of last year, China had a draft resolution. It was called with a beautiful name, Putting People at the Center of Efforts in promoting and protecting human rights. So it always sounds beautiful and harmonious and win-win, and you know that kind of language. But of course, there are underlying issues there where we have, I mean, we speaking the Europeans, the Western powers have certain worries, including the fact that China is in a certain way trying to change the whole accountability nature of human rights enforcement mechanisms. Country special rapporteurs, accountability mechanisms, and so on are all being a little bit pushed aside. So we there too, a mobilization and EU outreach to various partners has made that in the end, China has withdrawn that draft resolution, but they will come back. And we have to be aware they will come back probably pretty soon. And this year, the composition of the Human Rights Council is not really what we would call ideal with regard to defending European values. So let me just very quickly ask the panel members what they think about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone want to respond to that question and comment? And I would then maybe also ask you to respond and to close with any other closing remarks that you might have. May have. Yeah, Alexandra.
Yes, I mean, again, Jan, right to the target. All you said is absolutely true. The fact that language matters, and our Chinese friends have, of course, figured this out, that this is the way to basically sneak in, and not even that much through the back door any longer. It's absolutely true. The good news is that I think we are aware of that, and there is a clear mobilization on our side in terms to counter the Chinese language. I mean, it needed first to be detected. It needs to be understood, because again, it's something that is sneaky, and there needs to be a remedy to it. And there's clearly something that we're mobilized on and that we're working on. And in some issues, I think we're successfully able to get rid of what would look like innocent language and which isn't, but it's always at a price, and it's not easy at all. But yeah, it's there, and the awareness is growing, and it's there, sometimes a little bit last minute, like in the ITU case, but we're clearly in a new phase in terms of countering that. And I just wanted to thank Michelle as well for the very comprehensive answer that she's provided. I really believe her model is a good one, and I really think it's extremely relevant, and I'm glad that she sees it that way too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And since we now just started at the speaker who spoke last, maybe let's just go through every panelist in the reverse order. So Magdalena, would you like to answer or close with any other statements?
Thank you very much. I think I will return to Jan's comments in a second. I just want to maybe come back to Michelle's comments. I think that at least the way that I see the contestation is that there is no way we will get away from it anytime soon. It's going to stay with us because, as I said, this is becoming the globalization issues are becoming the core, and whatever we raise here, even what Jan raised, the facial recognition, these are things that matters for citizens, and that they are, you know, growingly sort of substantiate their views, and they might actually be quite they have a potential to be polarizing. This is what I'm trying to say, and the way I see that is that sort of to deal with that, we probably shall think about how best is to nest this. So that it is productive as much as possible, and obviously this is not an easy task. So that's just a comment back to Michelle. It's a difficult issue, and obviously this, yeah, right. But I'm thinking, and I'm thinking parliaments as a place where it should be mostly located within national parliaments for the EU matter, maybe being even more activated and sort of discussing this. When it comes to China, the only comments that I'm having for Jan's great insights and great questions is that one of the things that I'm seeing, and I'm coming from Central and Eastern Europe, as you know, is that the one of the things that I noticed recently is the growing Chinese, not only Chinese, but we talk here about China, the growing sort of attempts to sort of import the variety of opinions to the EU, particularly through tackling the countries that feel peripheral within the EU, the countries that feel sort of maybe othered. And I'm thinking here particularly about the Central and Eastern Europe, and we had the Chinese initiatives for that region that were mentioned already, that are sort of a vehicle to do that. And I think this is one of the issues that we need to be aware, is that China is yet another actor that is trying to divide the member states on many of those issues, and it actually using a vulnerabilities of the EU construction, its sort of the internal conflicts between the member states to somehow strengthen its position. And this probably is also something that we should tackle. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kolja, would you like to respond or share any other remarks?
Thank you very much, Katja, and thank you to the other panelists. I think the discussion shows very neatly, in a way, how the European Union, on the one hand, tries to respond to the contestation, to the polarization that it has been facing. And of course, one of the fundamental cornerstones of EU global action, of EU external action, is the multilateral system, is also the liberal international order that has become, over the last years, so often attacked, including by the United States administration. And the interesting thing will be to see to which extent there is a revival of the partnership between the EU and the United States, and to which degree that may actually lead to further polarization, especially with regards to China. And the question is, of course, whether we are, given that new constellation, actually seeing much more contestation than before, especially from China, but also from Russia, but yet on different issue areas.
Thank you. Michelle?
Well, Jan has made my day, okay? He has asked me a question that, or raised an issue that I hope he will enjoy my response. I think Jan is challenging the Brussels effect argument as the European promotion of rules has very uneven acceptance. Here, I think there is, a sort of an assumption sometimes that Europe is first mover advantage. And I think people selectively choose the issues that they want, such as GDPR, data privacy, and so forth. But it raises for me, in the context of this panel and conference, what happens when there is a contestation of rules, and what happens, because he mentioned a couple of international organizations, but what happens when there's a contestation of rules, for example, the US, the EU, and China, and whether it's privacy, digital, investment, industrial policy, and there is a plethora or fragmentation of rules. I don't think we should be looking at just the three. And I think we should be looking then at, if you are a rule maker, there are others across the globe that are rule takers. So the question then becomes, which one do you choose? Thank you.
Thank you. And that leaves 1 minute for Asad.
Three points, I think. Kolja, you mentioned inclusiveness of the multilateralism joint communication. On the last page, it's also talking about government, civil society, but also and academia, but also the private sector. So I think we shouldn't forget about them in order to try and get funding and get this rolling. The United States has a revolving door, so you get policymakers who become academics, academics who become politicians, so or actors. That would be interesting if we could transplant here. Number two, I think this is going to be a competition between techno-democracies and techno-autocracies in the future, the battle of standards. And I would disagree with Professor Jan Wouters. They're not European values, these are universal values. We should not be accused of double standards. I'm just beg to differ politely. Number three, just to let you know that, as Michelle, you mentioned, digital agenda, the EU is going to present a digital decade communication on the 9th of March. So this is just watch this space. But it's been a great pleasure. Thank you again. Look forward to the keynote speech.
Thank you very much. That doesn't leave me any time. I just would like to thank all the panelists for sharing all their insights and for really providing us with very thrilling 2.5 hours. And a very big thank you to everyone who asked a question and to really contributed to that debate that we just had. Thanks a lot, and I'll hand over to Kolja, I think.
Thank you very much, Katja, for chairing the second panel of our EUCROSS